My name is Seth. I moved to New Zealand in 2017. That was about 7 years ago. I moved from New York City. I wanted to start this podcast because I want you to hear stories of Americans who've already left America and the experience that they've had, how difficult or easy it is to do it, and what you should look out for. And the idea is that at some point, you can also leave America and you'll feel comfortable doing so. I get a little uncomfortable thinking back to the reasons I left America in the first place. They're very emotional. At the time, I was very angry. I was angry all the time. I lived in New York City. New York is stereotypically an angry place anyway. People could be pretty crazy on the subways. But more than that, there was just a sense that I wasn't the only one angry, that everyone was angry. We were angry about politics. We were angry about healthcare. We were angry about race relations. We were angry about climate change. I just spent every day reading the news and assuming that everyone else was an idiot. And it just gave me this deep sense of discomfort that I carried around with me every day. And I just wanted to leave. I was afraid that if I didn't take myself out of that situation, that one of two things would happen. Either I would just stew in that anger for a very long time, or I might become radicalized in some way. And I didn't want to end up having a heart attack from the stress, and I didn't want to have that reflect on my relationships with my family and my friends, because that's what I saw all around me. I saw people who were angry and disowning their families and disowning their friends because they didn't agree politically. But more than that, it didn't seem like there was any way out. I wanted a safe place for us to land, someplace where my family could feel comfortable and I could get away from all of that. I didn't really think about how hard it was going to be to move overseas. I just knew it was something I wanted to do and that I was going to do whatever it takes to get here. And that's pretty much how it worked out. I just did it step by step, one at a time, and got through each step. I didn't really think about how hard it was during the process or how hard it was going to be as a whole. And I think that's the best way to approach it. You have a goal in mind, you know where you want to be, and just work on getting there. So let me talk about the inciting incidents. There's always something that sends you over the edge, and this was mine. I had several, actually. And the first one, of course, was Trump being elected in 2016. I remember on election night, we were walking around New York City. We passed by the Democratic Convention Center. We passed by Trump's campaign headquarters. And we saw people in the streets. And we were watching the ticker on the big screen in the Times Square. And we kept seeing that it was close. It was incredibly close. And I think even at that moment, I was very disappointed because it shouldn't be close. So we went home and I tucked my kid into bed. He was 9 years old at the time. And he asked me, "Daddy, what if Trump wins?" And I said, "That won't happen. America won't let that happen. That would be a disaster. It would be the end of the world." And I woke up the next morning, read the newspaper, and Trump had won. So I knew I'd have to go back and tell my son something different. But it was at that moment that I realized I wanted to leave the country. You've always heard about people after the election crashing the servers of immigration around the world. I was one of those people. You also hear people say, if X happens in America, then I'm leaving. And most of those people never actually leave. I was one of the people that decided I actually wanted to leave. And so I spent the next year working very hard to get out of the country. Another inciting incident for me was a healthcare-related incident. My father-in-law, a few years prior to that, had passed away. He'd been traveling in Texas, and he had a heart attack. It took a month before he died. So he was in the hospital for a month, and when he passed away, he got the bill. The bill for that month was $1 million. Texas has a law that if you can't pay your medical bills, the hospital can go after your estate. So they can collect from the house, your car, all of your belongings, any kind of investments you might have made. So you can see that at $1 million, pretty much his estate would have been completely wiped out and his heirs would have received absolutely nothing. And it occurred to me that I thought, why would I spend my whole life working, accumulating, trying to make good investments when at the end of the day, the only people who are going to benefit from that are not my family, not my community. It's going to be a hospital. It takes $1 million to die in America, which when I'd had my son a few years before, it cost $25,000 just to give birth. These are staggering numbers. It shouldn't cost that much. There's no reason for it. And in other countries where the cost of healthcare is covered by the populace, healthcare itself is much cheaper, not just for taxpayers and for hospitals, but for individuals as well. So I thought to myself, why am I living in a system where everything I do and everything I make is going to be taken away? When I saw that statistic and I'd experienced this with my father-in-law's death, I just thought to myself, this is ridiculous. Everywhere else in the world has nationalized healthcare where this isn't an issue, where you don't lose your family inheritance to a hospital. So I decided that was a major reason why I wanted to leave. Another reason, on a positive note, is that my parents, when I was 1 year old, they're both teachers and they wanted to have an adventure. So they moved to Alaska and they lived in Alaska for 6 years, until I was 7 years old. And that was a great experience for me as a child. And I always grew up wanting to have an adventure of my own. And I thought it would be great to move overseas and experience that. I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but the reason I thought New Zealand would be an adventure similar to going to Alaska was because in Alaska, we lived in the native bush. We lived out in the tiny villages. And, I wore a sealskin jacket and boots when I was a kid. So I thought moving to New Zealand, where people still live in mud huts and wear grass skirts like 1950s Tahiti or something, I thought that would be a real adventure. Of course, I was completely wrong. It's nothing like that here. It's a very modern country, just like all the other countries outside of America around the world. So I was a little disappointed by that, but also a little bit relieved. But we're still having an amazing adventure here. New Zealand is fantastic for the outdoors, and that's what I've enjoyed doing. I learned to surf when I moved here. I was afraid of the ocean before I moved to New Zealand. I didn't even like to dip my toes in California. I was always afraid I'd get swept away by the sea. Irrational maybe, but now that I've learned to surf, learned to scuba dive, snorkel, I just really love, I can't get out of the water. I love being in the ocean. Another thing I wanted to leave America for was the fear. Americans seem to be afraid all the time of everything. We're terrified of crime. We think that there's a criminal just waiting around the corner to attack us. Even though crime statistics have fallen consecutively year after year for decades, if you look at the same graph of public perception of crime, it's increased just as much as crime has fallen. So the perception of crime in America is so high right now, which is why I think a lot of people feel justified in carrying firearms and everywhere they go, even in the supermarket. It's crazy. Guns was another thing I was afraid of. There's just too many guns in America. And it isn't just the citizens who have guns. It's the police who have guns. It's the army who has guns. Everybody has guns. And you just feel like there's a moment in time where people will start to use them. And I'm not saying that as a person who grew up in New York. I grew up out west. I grew up in shooting competitions. I was on the rifle team in high school. I grew up with guns. And I grew up with that mentality that it's important to have guns in your home. Where I grew up, I had 30 guns in a gun case in my house. So, yeah, and I know gun safety, and I'm a very good shot. So, and still, the presence of guns in America was frightening to me. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the number one reason children die in America is now gun deaths. And I think that's a statistic that should make us pause and take a serious look at gun ownership and gun safety, but it hasn't. And that was another disappointing thing to me, because every other democracy in the world has done that and has made gun ownership a responsibility to be taken seriously. Another one is, in America, we're always afraid of kidnappers. We're terrified that we're going to send our kid to the park and they're going to get snatched. So we become helicopter parents, and we just spend all of our time hovering around our children, making sure no one takes them. I always felt that was a disingenuous fear. There are not that many kidnappings in America. Not to say there aren't, there are plenty, but not as many as we worry about, I guess. The stranger danger is indicative of a society that does not trust each other. So I couldn't raise my child in that kind of society. New York is a lot safer, I feel, but we still watched our child like a hawk. Since moving to New Zealand, I've found that is quite a ridiculous way to look at life. In New Zealand, trust is very high. People trust strangers a great deal. I see children as young as 6 taking the train and the bus to school by themselves. And they do this because the parents know that if there's strangers around, those strangers are more likely to help the child get to school on time. And if the child has any problems, they can just walk up to any adult and ask them for help, and that adult will help them. It's the polar opposite of at least the perception in America. It's actually the way I grew up in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid. I felt comfortable and safe all the time. My parents let me ride my bicycle across the city all day long. They never worried about where I was. We didn't have cell phones, so they couldn't call me. I would just disappear for several hours at a time and go have fun with my friends and come back to the house when I wanted to. I think for most of Americans, those days are gone. And it's gone more for the perception and fear rather than actual statistics. When I told people I was leaving to move to New Zealand, they weren't as surprised as I thought they would be. My mother and sister were already living on the other side of the country, so moving halfway around the world was further, but they knew that, with that technology, you can still talk online, you can still talk on WhatsApp. My mother still visits frequently. So there was that connection that I guess you could say I'd already severed somewhat of a connection by moving to New York instead of living near my family. But moving to New Zealand was similar to that. So it wasn't too bad from my family side. My wife was a little skeptical, but we had been talking about moving overseas for some years. So she was open to the idea, though she wasn't entirely convinced. In fact, she wasn't convinced until 2 years after we moved here, but I'll tell you about that later. My kid was excited about the idea. When my parents moved back from Alaska to the continental United States, I didn't handle it well. I was 7 years old, and it was a poor experience for me, I guess, leaving my friends behind, leaving behind what I knew. And I was quite worried that my son would have a similar experience. But he had a completely different attitude. He said, "Dad, I'm going to dominate that school." And he has. He's done extremely well here. He's head of house now. He was the lead in his school play. He's got excellent grades. He's just doing very well here. And I'm very happy that it turned out the way it did. And I think it would turn out that way for many people, Americans who move here. Americans are quite popular here. The accent has worked well for him. The American accent is popular all around the world, especially here in New Zealand. People love it. My wife and I had wanted to move out of America just for personal reasons, for adventure, primarily, aside from the other reasons that I mentioned. So we looked at several countries. My wife is originally from Hong Kong. She bounced back and forth between Hong Kong and New York. So she's very much a city girl. But Hong Kong had been changed in recent years due to the politics, and so it wasn't as an attractive location for us. I wouldn't mind. I love Hong Kong, beautiful city. I've loved it every time I visit. But as a place to live and relocate, it was not at the top of the list. even though she speaks a few languages, she wanted to pick a country where she doesn't have to learn a new one. So France was out. That was at the top of my list. So moving to a country that only speaks English limited it down. England, obviously, as a Hong Kong resident, she could have got residency in England, or Ireland. I had applied for jobs in Ireland previously. They had a big boom in construction. But the politics in London are really no different than the politics in New York. They've got Brexit, they've got race relations problems. The political problems just seem too similar. So if we were trying to get away from the anger and politics, I didn't feel that London would probably be the best choice. We looked at Dubai. I worked for a bit in Dubai. Too hot. Singapore, equally hot, but humid, and I can't handle humidity. Japan, we looked at. That would have been interesting. My partner speaks a bit of Japanese, and she understands, she can read it because it's similar to the Chinese characters. But Japan is one of those places that we felt we would always be outsiders. And we wanted to find a place we could call home, where we could feel a part of the community, and didn't feel that we could do that in Japan. That left Australia and New Zealand. Australia, too many ways to die. Crocodiles, sharks, giant spiders, snakes, whatever. Just no thank you. So Australia was out, and that left New Zealand. New Zealand has almost no poisonous creatures whatsoever. It doesn't have snakes. I hate snakes. So that was in. So New Zealand was it. There were so many reasons why New Zealand made it to the top of the list. It is consistently rated one of the happiest places in the world, in the top 10 when it's not competing for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It's considered one of the safest places on Earth. So crime is very minor here. Of course it happens. Crime happens everywhere in the world. But everyone here feels incredibly safe. Walking at night, going wherever you want to, meeting strangers. It's just an incredibly safe place. The New Zealand passport gets you pretty much everywhere that the American passport gets you, except you don't have to worry about being kidnapped and held for ransom in the way that they love to kidnap Americans. New Zealand has its own agriculture. Its agriculture capacity is 5 times the New Zealand population. So worst case scenario, if we were cut off from the world somehow, we would always be able to eat. That is not true of most countries in the world. If you look at the deficit that most countries are in, they can barely feed half their population. And I encourage you to look that up wherever you live. Your country can probably feed half or 1/4 of your population if left to its own devices. So that was a big plus to me. We'll always have a surplus of food in this country, worst comes to worst. We import everything else, which is going to be a problem, but at least we won't die from starvation. Nuclear war was a big reason I moved here.
You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. That signal means to stop whatever you are doing. First, you duck, and then you cover.
I grew up with that fear. I grew up with air raid sirens and diving under your desk and practicing nuclear drills at school. When I was a kid, I must have been 10 years old or so. I dug a bunker in our backyard. I just dug down and created an actual hole that I expected to live in case of nuclear war. Nuclear war is still, we're on the brink every day. We're, as they say, seconds from midnight. And if you look at what happens if China and the US decide to get into nuclear war, or Russia and the US, or, well, frankly, the US and anybody decides to get into a nuclear war. If you look at the way patterns of weather work, they don't translate across the equator very quickly. So the northern hemisphere would have nuclear fallout and radiation for a very long time. New Zealand would be one of the last places to experience that, assuming no one shot at New Zealand, which let's hope they don't. Climate change, exactly the same thing. If you look at climate change models, you'll see that the heat from CO2 is incredibly concentrated on the northern hemisphere. And while it is affecting global weather patterns, the heat itself barely transcends into the southern hemisphere. It's quite amazing when you see it. New Zealand itself has looked at its climate projections, and we're supposed to get a lot more rain. But other than that, not a lot of major changes here. It's a very mountainous island, so sea level rises wouldn't affect most of the country. The heat will increase, but nowhere near like what you're going to see in Sydney and Mumbai and LA. And the rain, getting more rain, is actually good for us because 50% of our energy comes from dams, and that water being stored in the dams is the best reason we'd be able to keep our electricity. One of our largest agricultural regions is also the driest. And so more rain to that region would probably do us well as far as agriculture. I'm not downplaying climate change in any way. What I am saying is that when it comes to climate change, New Zealand is one of the least affected countries on the planet. So if you're looking for a place to weather the storm, whether it's the political crisis over the next few years or everything else that's going to happen in the rest of your lifetime, your best bet is in New Zealand.
So what are you waiting for?
If you're thinking seriously about leaving America, especially if you want to move to New Zealand, check out our sponsor, vbi.nz. That's NZ to us Americans. You can book an appointment with someone who can answer your questions about immigration and help you understand your strengths moving overseas. The link is in the show notes below. Please subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment, let me know what you think. Are you planning to leave America? What are your reasons? And where would you go? I want to hear about it. See you soon, or as we say in New Zealand, see you out there.